Donald Trump has made it clear that one of his top goals is to maintain the global dominance of the US dollar. When he campaigned to be US president in 2024, he promised that he would punish any country around the world that sought alternatives to the US dollar by hitting them with 100% tariffs.
Many countries are leaving the dollar. They're not going to leave the dollar with me. I'll say, you leave the dollar. You're not doing business with the United States because we're going to put 100% tariff on your goods. Sir, we would like very much to get back to the dollar immediately. Thank you very much. It's so easy. I don't know.
Donald Trump also warned that if the US dollar lost its status as the global reserve currency, it would be like losing a major war.
I'm very much a traditionalist. I like staying with the dollar. You know that from when I was there. It's make the dollar the choice. I hate when countries go off the dollar. I would not allow countries to go off the dollar because when we lose that standard, that will be like losing a revolutionary war. That will be a hit to our country, just like losing a war. And we can't let that happen. And too many countries now are fighting to get off the dollar.
Now, this is all quite ironic because since Trump has returned for his second term as US president, his tariffs and trade war have actually accelerated the decline of the US dollar and the global move toward de-dollarization, which refers to the tendency of other countries to seek alternatives to the US dollar and use other currencies in international trade and to hold other assets in their foreign exchange reserves. Western media outlets have warned that Trump's tariffs have put the dollar's safe haven status in jeopardy. Until recently, de-dollarization was largely associated with global South countries, especially those that are members of BRICS, that was founded by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. BRICS has been creating new institutions to try to encourage de-dollarization, seeking alternatives to the US dollar in an attempt to reform the international financial system, which is dominated by the US and its currency. And we have seen more and more signs of this. The Financial Times published a long report on how China is quietly diversifying away from US government debt, US Treasury securities, and seeking alternatives. I'm going to talk about that a bit later in this analysis today. But what's incredible about this accelerated move toward de-dollarization is that it's not just countries doing this for geopolitical reasons, it's also financial institutions. And the Financial Times published another article about Deutsche Bank, the major German bank. The global head of foreign exchange research at Deutsche Bank said this, quote, "We are witnessing a simultaneous collapse in the price of all US assets, including equities, the dollar versus alternative reserve foreign exchange, and the bond market. We are entering uncharted territory in the global financial system," end quote. This analyst at a major German bank then continued saying that the market is rapidly de-dollarizing. In a typical crisis environment, the market would be hoarding dollar assets, but instead, the market has lost faith in US assets. It is actively selling down US assets. And as this Deutsche Bank researcher said, quote, "US administration policy," that is Trump administration policy, "is encouraging a trend toward de-dollarization to safeguard international investors from a weaponization of dollar liquidity," end quote. So this is the ultimate irony. Donald Trump claimed that he would save the dominance of the US dollar by threatening countries all around the world. But in reality, his tariff threats have only accelerated the move toward de-dollarization, not just for geopolitical reasons, but for financial reasons. And what's incredible is we're even seeing longtime US allies like Japan float the possibility of selling the huge sums of US government debt that they hold as a bargaining chip, because the Trump administration is trying to impose these aggressive demands on its so-called allies, and they're pushing back and saying they're not going to tolerate it. And what all of this is showing is how rapidly Donald Trump's trade war blew back and blew up in his face. Trump first declared tariffs on countries all around the world at the beginning of April on so-called Liberation Day. That was on the 2nd of April. And then a week later, Trump temporarily paused the tariffs he threatened on countries around the world, instead imposing a blanket 10% tariff on all countries. But he singled out China and rapidly raised tariffs on China to 145%, which essentially is a kind of nuclear trade war. Trump already started a trade war on China during his first term as president back in 2018, but now in his second term, he accelerated that to a full-on nuclear trade war. And then Trump's Treasury Secretary, the billionaire hedge fund manager Scott Bessent, said the quiet part loud, and he admitted that what the U.S. is trying to do is to contain China, to weaken China. Bessent revealed that Trump wanted to use tariffs to force other countries to join the U.S., and as Bessent said, quote, "We can approach China as a group," end quote. So Washington was trying to use its tariffs to force Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and India to all work together to isolate China in what Bessent described as a, quote, "grand encirclement strategy." However, that strategy has not worked as the Trump administration thought it would. In fact, it also blew back. And immediately after Trump announced all these new tariffs, including sky-high tariffs on Vietnam, which is one of the major trading partners of the U.S., what happened? China's President Xi Jinping took a trip to Vietnam and had a very friendly meeting with Vietnamese leadership, and they signed more than 40 bilateral agreements deepening their partnership. So the U.S. attempt to try to recruit Vietnam against China did not work. In fact, Trump's tariffs have been pushing China, South Korea, and Japan to cooperate more closely, despite the fact that these are countries that have very significant differences. I mean, Japan colonized China and South Korea. There's still a lot of anger in the region toward Japan and the horrific imperial crimes it committed in the 1930s and 40s. Yet despite those differences, just a few days before Trump announced these tariffs on so-called Liberation Day in April, what happened? For the first time in 5 years, South Korea, China, and Japan held an economic meeting to discuss ways in which they can cooperate to soften the impact of Trump's trade war. And even in Japan, which is one of the closest U.S. allies on earth, there's more and more outrage over Trump's tariff threats. Japanese lawmakers are publicly condemning Trump, comparing him to a, quote, delinquent kid, end quote, over his tariff threats. And Japan has been holding trade negotiations with the U.S., and the talks are not going nearly as well as the Trump administration hoped. Japan has been pushing back quite a bit against the threat of U.S. tariffs on Japanese autos, that's cars, and also steel. And one of the most shocking developments in these trade talks is that Japan's finance minister floated the idea that Japan could sell off the huge sums of U.S. Treasury securities, that is U.S. government debt that it has, as part of a negotiating tactic, which would be a quite extreme measure, but it shows that Japan is pushing back. And this idea that the Trump administration had, that they can simply bully all these countries and push them around, even longtime U.S. allies like Japan, which has been militarily occupied by the United States for 80 years, even Japan is pushing back. Now, one of the main reasons that Trump took a step back from his tariff threats in April is because of backlash in the bond market. So Trump announced these massive tariffs on the 2nd of April, and in the week following that, there was a rapid increase in the yield on the U.S. 10-year Treasury note. This is one of the most important financial assets, not only in the U.S. economy, but in the global economy, because other interest rates are often set based on the yield on the U.S. 10-year note. So when the yield shot up, this was a sign that investors were selling their holdings of U.S. Treasury securities and seeking other assets, and that U.S. government debt was no longer being seen as the safest asset. This really terrified the Trump administration and forced Trump to take a step back. So if a major holder of U.S. Treasury securities started to sell off that debt, this could cause a crisis in the U.S. bond market. But Trump is still insisting on imposing more and more tariffs. He says this is only a temporary pause, and he's very serious about these tariff threats. So now other countries, including the major U.S. ally Japan, are saying, fine, if you want to do this to us, we can respond by causing a crisis in your bond market. Japan is the single largest foreign holder of U.S. Treasury securities. That's U.S. government debt. Japan's central bank holds more than $1.1 trillion of U.S. Treasury securities in its reserves. And you know what the second biggest foreign holder of U.S. government debt is? China, the Chinese mainland, with over $700 billion of U.S. Treasury securities in its reserves. And in response to Trump's nuclear trade war on China, the Wall Street Journal warned that Beijing has some cards that it can also play. As the Wall Street Journal put it, China has two major financial weapons: its holdings of U.S. treasuries and its currency, the yuan. As this leading U.S. newspaper put it, quote, "The escalating trade conflict between the U.S. and China has reignited fears that Beijing could use financial markets to hit back at Washington. There have long been fears that China could dump the U.S. treasuries that make up a large chunk of its foreign exchange reserves," end quote. Now, China has been slowly but gradually de-dollarizing its reserves over the past decade. China's official holdings of U.S. Treasury securities peaked in 2014 and have fallen since then. And if you look at China's investments in U.S. assets as a percentage of its GDP, it has been steadily declining since the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And the Financial Times published a long report detailing how Trump's tariffs against China and trade war have only accelerated the move toward de-dollarization in Beijing. This report quoted influential Chinese scholars who wrote, quote, "The safety of U.S. treasuries is no longer a given. That era is behind us, and we should be concerned about that change from the safeguarding perspective of our treasury holdings," end quote. And another major reason cited by Chinese scholars was the fact that in 2022, the United States and also the European Union froze and seized around $300 billion worth of dollar and euro denominated assets that were held by Russia's central bank. This was in response to the proxy war in Ukraine between NATO, led by the US on one side, and Russia on the other. But Russia was not the only country whose reserves were frozen and effectively stolen by the US and the broader West. There have been several other examples of countries in the global South who have been targeted by what's essentially international piracy by the West, including Iran, North Korea, Libya, Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan. Now, those countries are relatively small, whereas Russia is a huge country, a major power. So when the US-led West seized Russia's foreign assets, that was a wake-up call to countries around the world, and officials at their central banks started thinking about how they could diversify away from US dollar assets before they're the next victim. And this is certainly what's been happening for years now in China. Now, to be clear, this Financial Times report makes it clear that Chinese officials don't want to simply dump all of their US Treasury holdings for a few different reasons. First of all, this would be a kind of last resort. It would be a major escalation, and China is actually trying to be diplomatic, and it's defending itself, and it's responding to Trump's attacks proportionately, but China doesn't want to escalate it further. And also, China doesn't want to lose a lot of the value of its reserves, because if China were to dump all of these US treasuries, then the value of existing US treasury securities would fall. Yields would go up, and when yields go up, the current bonds that are out there, they fall in price. So China doesn't want to hurt itself by reducing the value of its holdings as it dumps them onto the market. But again, this is a last resort if China needed to do so. The Financial Times report makes it clear that what China prefers is a gradual transition from treasuries to other assets, including foreign bonds and also gold. And Chinese officials describe this as maneuvering on a tightrope. However, as Trump continues to escalate his trade war against China, it's increasingly untenable to be walking on a tightrope when you have a bunch of fire and a volcano under you. And Chinese officials are warning that what the Trump administration is doing could basically amount not only to a seizure of China's holdings, but even a default on U.S. national debt. Because in the financial press, there has been more and more discussion of the idea of a so-called Mar-a-Lago Accord based on the Plaza Accord that the Ronald Reagan administration imposed on U.S. allies in 1985. And Trump's top economic advisor, the economist Stephen Myron, has proposed the possibility of the U.S. forcing other countries to swap their current Treasury holdings for 100-year U.S. government bonds with no coupon, no yield. So that means that with inflation, over time, other countries are going to lose value on the bonds that they hold, U.S. government bonds. So this is essentially a way by which other countries will fund the U.S. government. They'll be giving their money to fund the U.S.
They could simply write checks to Treasury. That would help us finance global public goods as well.
And Chinese financial officials are saying that this would essentially amount to a de facto U.S. government default on its debt. So this would not only impact China, it would impact all countries around the world, because basically all central banks around the world at least have some of their reserves held in U.S. assets, largely U.S. Treasury securities. Now, as I said, I want to make this clear. It's not just Donald Trump that is responsible for this de-dollarization. This has been a process going on for well over a decade. Between 2015 and 2022, China's holdings of U.S. Treasury securities fell by 17%. But in the past few years, it has rapidly accelerated, especially after the seizure of Russia's U.S. assets in 2022. So between 2022 and 2024, China reduced its official Treasury holdings by more than 27%. So again, we've seen an acceleration, and Trump's trade war is going to only accelerate that even further. So this raises an important question. As China reduces its holdings of U.S. assets, what is it replacing them with? Because China has a massive current account surplus, a huge trade surplus with the rest of the world. So it has all of these excess dollars and other currencies it gets from trading. What does it do with those excess currencies? If it simply converts everything into yuan, into its local currency, that would cause the price of the yuan to go up significantly against other currencies, which would hurt the competitiveness of Chinese exports. China doesn't want to have an overvalued yuan, which could contribute to deindustrialization and many of the problems we've seen in the US. So instead, China has been seeking alternatives. And what have those alternatives been? Well, one of them is that China has been seeking holdings of sovereign debt of other countries, including in Europe, so different European bonds from Germany and Switzerland, and also Japan. So buying Japanese assets denominated in the Japanese currency, the yen. And another major asset that China has been investing in is gold. And it's not just China that's doing this. There are many countries, especially in the global south, that have been stockpiling gold in their reserves. And if you look at the list of the top 10 countries that in the past decade have added the most gold to their reserves, you can see that many of them are in BRICS or BRICS curious. They're around BRICS, including number 1, China, number 2, Russia, number 3, Turkey, which has been invited to join BRICS, number 4, India, which is the I in BRICS, also Kazakhstan, Singapore, Qatar, Uzbekistan, and many other countries, especially in the global south. And why is that? Well, a big reason is that these countries are afraid that the US could seize their holdings of US Treasury securities, just like the US seized Russia's holdings and Iran's holdings and Venezuela's holdings. However, I should emphasize that this is not just geopolitical. It also goes back to the 2008-2009 financial crisis in the US. Because if you analyze global data of central bank holdings of gold, you can see that they were declining throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. But then immediately in 2009, with the US financial crisis, what happened? That trend suddenly reversed, and we've seen a significant increase in central bank purchases of gold. So this is another sign that other countries are not only de-dollarizing for geopolitical reasons, but simply they are losing faith in the US financial system, given how the US economy has been built on a massive bubble. And as the US economy has financialized, it's looking more and more dangerous. This is a big reason why the price of gold has been skyrocketing for years, but especially in 2024 and 2025, with more and more countries afraid of Trump's tariffs and potential seizure of their treasury holdings, or fears of a de facto US government default on its debt through the Mar-a-Lago Accord and these 100-year zero-coupon bonds. There's more and more instability, there's more and more uncertainty, and foreign investors, including a lot of foreign central banks, have been piling into gold, which surpassed $3,000 and has continued rising very rapidly. What we're essentially seeing is a kind of unofficial US dollar devaluation against gold. You know, the US dollar has been at the heart of the global financial system since at least 1944 in the Bretton Woods Conference at the end of World War II, if not a bit earlier in the 1920s and 30s. And now what we're seeing is that as the role of the US dollar declines, there's a kind of unofficial devaluation of the US dollar, at least against gold. And at least in the short term, this is what we're seeing with the US dollar falling against many other currencies. Now, I should be clear here. The foreign exchange market is often pretty volatile, and it's very possible that the US dollar could go back up. But in response to Trump's tariffs and foreign investors selling off US assets, what we've seen is that the US dollar has fallen pretty substantially against the yen, the Japanese currency. And we've also seen the US dollar fall pretty significantly against the euro by more than 8% so far in 2025, which is a pretty significant move. And this is because a lot of foreign investors have been selling their holdings of US assets, including US Treasury securities, and instead converting their dollars to euros and buying euro-denominated assets, including European bonds like German bonds, for instance. And the same thing has been happening with the Swiss franc. You know, Switzerland is not part of the European Union. It has its own currency. And the US dollar has fallen nearly 9% against the Swiss franc so far in 2025. Again, as foreign investors sell US assets and buy Swiss assets. So this is all very important, and I would say historic, because, you know, I've been reporting for several years now on the global de-dollarization movement, with countries around the world seeking alternatives to the dominance of the US dollar. And critics of my work, skeptics, have long said that there's no alternative to the US dollar. The common talking point that they repeat is that the US dollar may have its issues, but they say that the US dollar is the cleanest shirt in the laundry basket with other dirty currencies. But what we're actually seeing is that this talking point, that there's no alternative to the US dollar and there's no alternative to the US Treasury security as the backbone of the global financial system, it's proving not to be true. There are increasingly alternatives. Increasingly, it's global investors who are de-dollarizing, and it's even longtime US allies like Japan and some European countries that are seeking alternatives to the US dollar. And the more that Donald Trump threatens foreign countries and says he's going to impose more and more tariffs and wage trade war and sanctions and other forms of economic warfare, this is actually blowing back, and it's accelerating the decline of the dominance of the US dollar. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.